A major mechanism for Darwinian evolution is mutation. Random chance mutations are necessary to generate the raw material for molecules to man evolution. These mutations must be beneficial and lead to the formation of new traits so that one kind of organism over time can evolve into a completely different kind of organism. However, mutations have never been observed to do this. Coming up on today's edition of Origins, Mutations, Evolution's Disappointment with Dr. Georgia Purdom. Hello and welcome to Origins. I'm Ray Heipel. It's an honor to be your host today. During this program, we showcase interesting guests who present evidence from science along with other important facts validating the truth of creation and the accuracy of the Bible. Today's guest, Dr. Georgia Purdom, received a PhD in molecular genetics from The Ohio State University. She has won a variety of honors and been a professor of biology. Dr. Purdom has also published research papers in both secular and creation peer-reviewed technical journals. She now serves as Ministry Content Administrator, Speaker, Author, and Researcher for Answers in Genesis in Kentucky. Wow, welcome Dr. Purdom. It's an honor to have you today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
We're going to be talking about mutations, evolution's disappointment. What is a mutation? What does that mean?
Well, a mutation is any really change in the DNA itself. It could be a deletion, it could be an addition, it could be moving part of the DNA around. Lots of things fall into that category of mutation. Everything was created perfect originally, but since the fall, mutations have played a role in changing that DNA.
Okay. Well, tell us how we're going to look at this with regard to your program.
Well, I think it's really important, anytime that we're looking at the evidence in science and dealing with the issue of creation and evolution, why is it so important to be able to give answers when it comes to science? And one of the verses that I really like is 1 Peter 3:15. But in your heart, set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. And that is why we give answers in genetics. That's why one of the reasons I'm a creation scientist is because I want to help people understand really what the issues are and to be able to give some basic answers and then help people know maybe where they can get some more information on these things.
So the scientists, in effect, they set a lot of the agenda. I mean, they begin to talk about these things and begin to say that this proves either the Bible isn't true or proves something that, in effect, would negate the Bible. And then it's our responsibility, really, as Christians, right, to give an answer, to say, wait a minute, we can talk about this subject too, but we can show where either you're making an error or you're making an interpretation that's not really in line with what the evidence or what the facts say.
Right, and interpretation is really the key, because that's what we need to understand, is that when we look at science, when we look at DNA, we kind of call that observational science, because it's something in the here and now. We can physically study the DNA, but how we look at that DNA as it relates to the past and what has happened in the past to get to where we are today, it really depends on our starting point or our worldview. When we really look honestly at the science, at the observational science, we see it confirms God's word. But when we look at it, if you start with an evolutionary perspective, there's certain things you'd expect to see, and you're not seeing those things. There's all kinds of problems, there's all kinds of conflicts, and it doesn't match up with what they believe about the past and how everything came to be.
All right, so mutations, that sounds like a bad word, but from what I understand, evolutionists like mutations, right?
Right, they do. Well, they need mutations. So they need something called beneficial mutations, okay? They need to be able to generate the raw genetic change that they need to make one kind of organism become a completely different kind of organism. Because that's really the kind of changes that we're talking about, like dinosaurs to birds, for example. Okay, that's big change, right?
Yes,
to be able to do that. But the thing is, really, beneficial mutations do not exist.
Okay.
Now let me explain what I mean by that. There are beneficial outcomes of mutations, but it's only in specific environments that they exist. So it might be beneficial over here, but it's not beneficial over here in a completely different environment.
Okay, okay.
So it really depends on context, is what I always say. It's context dependent. And mutations really can't do what evolution needs. They can only alter what's already there.
Okay, so it can't create something brand new.
Right, it can't do that. And if you think about, I always use the dinosaur to bird example because it's commonly, purported to be true. Think about it. If you're going to go from a dinosaur to a bird, you're going to have feathers, right? I mean, that's a big thing. You're going to have to develop the ability to fly. And so that requires new genetic information. That's not in the dinosaur DNA. You have to have a way to add it. You can't just tweak what's already there, so to speak. And that's just something that's never been observed.
All right. So that's the scientific method again, right? Observing, drawing conclusions, and in a sense, I guess you could say that beneficial mutations then is not observable science. Would that be correct?
Right. And like I say, it's not that they don't occur, but it's just not doing what evolution needs them to do. Evolution needs them to do new things, and they're not doing anything new. They're just altering what's already there.
And you said that could be beneficial in a limited context, but not over creating something brand new. That's the point. Okay.
So I want to be able to give you some examples of that, and I'm going to go up here to do that.
Great.
And one of the favorite examples of evolutionists is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. And so normally when you have an infection and you take an antibiotic, the idea is that the antibiotic will interact with a protein that the bacteria produce, and as a result, the bacteria die. At least that's what you want to happen, right?
Okay. All right.
That's a good thing. But sometimes bacteria get mutated. And then when you take the antibiotic, it can't interact with this protein over here because the protein has changed. It's no longer normal. It's mutant, okay? And so when you take the antibiotic, they don't die. They're resistant to it. Now, is that good for the bacteria in that environment in you? Sure, they survive.
Yes.
But it's not good for you, obviously.
No.
It's just good for them. But why do they survive? Not because they've gotten better, because they've actually lost something.
Oh, that's interesting.
This is mutant.
Okay. So the mutant bacteria that survives, it survives the antibiotic, is actually not a better bacteria. That sounds like what you're saying.
This usually doesn't work as well. Whatever it normally does, maybe this protein builds the cell wall, maybe it breaks down nutrients, whatever it might be, but it can't do that really as well anymore, or maybe can't even do it at all. So it's hard. It's going to be, they're surviving maybe when there's lots of antibiotics, lots of other stuff's dying off, but overall they're just not really fit.
So in a normal bacteria world, this kind of bacteria that survives the antibiotic is weaker. It's not as lively, or maybe we could say defective, and that's why it survives, because it's defective.
And let me show you a really good example of that with ulcers. So ulcers are caused by this bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. So when you take an antibiotic, it is absorbed through the cell wall, so it goes into the cell wall of the bacteria, and that's a good thing, you want that. And then what the bacteria do is they produce an enzyme. An enzyme is a protein. So I talked about before, that's what the antibiotic interacts with. It interacts with a protein that the bacteria are producing.
And it needs to do that, the bacteria needs to do that to survive, right? It needs these proteins.
It's a protein that they produce to do things like break down nutrients or build a cell wall, or whatever it is that they need.
So the treatment then is going after something the bacteria has to do, right? As we're applying this antibiotic, we know the bacteria needs this protein. And so, science is really doing a great thing here and finding a way to kill the bacteria.
And that's what antibiotics, that's what makes them so great, because they're specific against bacteria. They're not interacting with our proteins, and causing harm to us. We just wanted to cause harm to the bacteria.
Gotcha.
So what happens in this case is that the antibiotic basically interacts with protein that they normally produce, and it produces a poison. Okay. So that's a bad thing, obviously, for the bacteria. It's going to create this poison between the antibiotic and the protein interacting together, create a poison, and obviously that poison kills the bacteria.
That's what we want. We want to see that guy dead. We want the ulcer to go away.
It's good for us, right? Bad for them.
Okay.
So that's the key there. Now, because antibiotics have been overused and abused, especially in third world countries. We don't see this quite as much here in the United States, but because of that, we've got a lot of mutant H. pylori floating around out there, okay, and in people. And these bacteria have mutations that basically don't allow the antibiotic to work the way we want it to work.
Okay.
So when you take an antibiotic, even if you have a mutant, okay, bacteria, the antibiotic still gets to go in, but guess what? They've got a mutation in their DNA that doesn't allow them to produce the protein at all.
Okay.
They're not producing it at all. So they've stopped doing that. So what's going to happen? Well, if there's no protein to interact with the antibiotic, there's no poison created, right? Like we saw before, and so they don't die.
Okay.
Right? Because they can't produce the poison, so there's not going to be any death.
So in effect, the antibiotic doesn't really hurt this kind of bacteria because of its inability to do something that it would normally need for its own health.
Right, exactly. So so what is the mutation doing? It's not increasing it, it's not making it better, it's not gaining complexity, it's actually lost something, right? They have they don't produce that protein at all or that enzyme at all. So they have survived, but because of less information,
so would it be accurate then to say that this is, maybe a defective bacteria in generally speaking, if you have the normal bacteria population, this one's defective, this one's weaker, again, in a normal environment. Would that be accurate to say?
Yes. And so when we're talking normal environments, these guys aren't going to do as well. When we're talking environments like a hospital or a nursing home where there's a lot of sick people and a lot of antibiotics, those antibiotics kill most other bacteria. These are the guys that survive. And so they're going to do fine in that environment. They don't have to compete with anybody for food, right? It's just them. So they're going to make it and they're going to do well. When you're taking antibiotics and stuff, the problem is it kills off a lot of the good guys, right? And so the good guys aren't there to compete with the bad guys. And the bad guys win, essentially. And that would be true if you're talking inside your body, in the environment, whatever. We need the good bacteria.
Isn't that interesting? Because I know when, I've had to take an antibiotic, the doctor will say, if you're going to be on it for some time, buy some yogurt. with bacterial cultures,
because you need those. Most bacteria do really good things, right? And we need them to compete with the bad guys, so to speak, the mutant guys. But still, bacteria are still bacteria. They're not gaining the kind of information that they need to be able to go from one kind of organism to another. And so evolution will often say time is the key. Time is not the key. I always say to evolutionists, I'll give you all the time in the world. The problem you have is that you don't have a genetic mechanism to gain. Mutation doesn't do what you need it to do to go from one kind of organism to a completely different kind of organism. It's moving, I always say, the organism staying horizontal, it's not moving vertically, right? Evolution requires an upward movement, a progression, and what we're seeing is just really it's staying on this horizon. We're just getting variation within the bacteria, not the bacteria gaining the information to go to anything else. I don't care how much time. You can give it all the time you want, but it's just going to keep taking steps backwards and not taking those steps forward that you need to be able to go to something completely different.
Yeah, you have, in effect, a weaker organism, and over time, the population of weakness really growing. It really the opposite of that, complexity, strength.
Right, and that's why I say mutations are evolution's disappointment, because they're degrading, they're tearing down, they're making things worse overall, they're not making things better. And we certainly see that even with people. We're getting worse. I mean, we're getting more disease, we're getting more defects because we've had 6,000 years to accumulate these mutations and to move in the wrong direction.
Isn't that interesting? So mutations are actually doing the opposite. They're taking us down rather than up.
Right.
We're going to hold that thought right there. Stay with us. Our subject is mutations. Fascinating stuff. We'll be back after these messages. Welcome back to Origins. We're talking to Dr. Georgia Purdom, who's been sharing some fascinating things about mutations. Dr. Purdom, it seems like mutations are not all evolutionists say that they're cracked up to be.
No, they're not. They're definitely not doing what they need them to do over long periods of time. And I know before the break we were talking about antibiotic resistant bacteria, and I wanted to give some more information on that because a creation scientist by the name of Dr. Kevin Anderson with the Creation Research Society has actually done some research looking at different antibiotics and then how do the bacteria become resistant to those antibiotics. Is there ever an example, I showed just one, right, with Helicobacter pylori. Is there ever an example where the bacteria gain something, right?
Of course, I don't know if it's said this way, but the assumption is and become a better organism,
right.
which we've seen in general isn't true.
Right.
But what has Kevin Anderson shown?
Right, so he shows a list of the different, antibiotics here and many different ones, which I'm not going to even try to pronounce all of those. And then the phenotype providing the resistance. Now, phenotype means, like, what are their characteristics, kind of what are they showing on the outside? Okay. In humans, phenotype would be like your hair color, your eye color, things like that. Okay. But what we see here is that, and what I've kind of highlighted in yellow, is that in every single case, the bacteria have lost something, right? Or it's been reduced to gain the resistance to the antibiotic. There's never been a gain, right? They've lost certain things, they've reduced certain things. So maybe it's so the antibiotic can't get in anymore, or maybe it's so some regulation has changed. But something has changed such that, yes, it makes them resistant to the antibiotic, but it takes away something that they normally did. Now, some people might say, well, if it's lost the ability to do something, shouldn't the bacteria just die? And so I want to address that just a little bit. No, because bacteria have backup mechanisms. I mean, if one protein is disabled and can't do this anymore, can't do it as well, typically God has designed them with the ability to be able to have other proteins that can sometimes come in and do that function as well. Maybe not as well, maybe not as good, most likely not, but they're able to kind of help it out. And one other, really great example that I want to share with you, because I really like this work that's been done, and that's with something called long-term lines of E. coli. Okay. So pretty much everybody knows what E. coli is. It's a normal gut bacteria. And Dr. Richard Linsky up in Michigan has been doing a lot of work on E. coli, and I really admire his work. It's great work. And what he's done is, in the lab, he has been growing continuously since 1988 E. coli. He's had over 64,000 generations of bacteria. So basically, he puts the bacteria in a dish, they grow. When they run out of nutrients, he replaces the media, puts new media in there. So they continue to grow. He takes samples of them at all these different time points. So he's really trying to show how bacteria change over time, is what he's doing. And in the lab, of course, he's feeding them nutrients, they're getting everything they need. So he's seeing the equivalent of millions of years, essentially, okay? Because bacteria don't take long to reproduce, obviously, and they reproduce faster in the lab usually, and so he's seen the equivalent of that.
Well, 64,000 generations, I mean, I don't know how many years that would be for, you know, an 80-year-old person. We're talking a lot of time. And then the dinosaurs, you know.
Right. So are the bacteria anything different, right, after 64,000 generations? So that's what we want to really address and look at. And the evolutionists love his work. And I want to share with you just a quote from one of them, Jerry Coyne, who said, Linsky's experiment is also yet another poke in the eye for anti-evolutionists. So that would be me. That would be a creationist. He thinks it's poking me in the eye. The thing I like most is it says you can get these complex traits evolving by a combination of unlikely events. That's just what creationists say can't happen. So what's he saying? He's saying Linsky's work shows that these bacteria are gaining things. They're gaining complexity. They're changing. They're moving in a certain direction. Right. So is that really what happened? And that's bad, he says, for creationists, because they say that can't happen. So the question is, does that really happen? We can look at that. We can look at Linsky's papers, and we can look at his bacteria. We can look at what he's found and say, is it indeed what has happened with these bacteria?
Yeah, so this is a statement that's making an interpretation. And again, we need to really be careful with that because, you know, if we watch the news or anything else, you can sort of spin anything to make it sound.
Let's look at the science to see if that's what they've really found. So I would agree that the bacteria 64,000 generations out is more fit than the bacteria they started with. Okay? I agree it's more fit. But in what sense is it more fit? And really, it's more fit to live in the lab due to the loss or reduction of things. Again, no gain, right?
Isn't that interesting? So all those generations in the lab, whatever would have been hurting some populations in the lab probably die off or whatever, and the other ones that don't have that are...
Right. And see, in the lab, they're losing certain things that you honestly would expect them to lose. So for example, they lose the ability to break down certain sugars because they're never given those sugars. So they don't need that genetic information to do that.
So it dies out.
Yeah, they don't. So if you get a mutation, they can't break it down anymore. It doesn't matter, right? They don't need that. They've lost their ability to move. So E. coli have flagella and they move, and so they've lost the ability to do that. Well, they don't need to move, right? They just need to stay in the dish and they get everything they need.
So for staying in a dish, they're more fit for standing still. But if they were in a place where they needed to move, they wouldn't be more fit.
Yes, they've lost certain regulatory control. So what I say is they've gotten fat and lazy, right? They've gotten more fit to live in the lab.
In the lab, that's
but
the key.
Overall, they're not more fit. Okay, and so that really is the problem for them. And so that's what we need to realize. This is a great experiment. These are great things that are going on, but it's not what the evolutionists say it is. It's not gaining complexity. It's not gaining new things. It's just altering what's already there, degrading things, losing things. If you take these bacteria 64,000 generations out and put them with normal E. coli, they're not going to make it. They're not going to make it for very long at all because they just have lost so many things that they can't live well in another environment.
So in effect, he has produced, maybe without trying, but just because of the environment, you know, the petri dish or whatever that he has them in and the kind of food that he's feeding them and so forth, you know, they don't have to hunt or track down their food like I guess normal bacteria would. It's just spoon-fed to them and they're sitting there. In effect, he's created a whole population of mutant bacteria. You wouldn't see this kind of bacteria ordinarily. And if you did, if it would live anywhere but a petri dish, it's not gonna survive.
Yeah, it's not gonna do it.
Isn't that something?
So what we see in summary is that while there are some beneficial outcomes to mutations in certain environments, like we saw with the antibiotic-resistant bacteria, it just is allowing limited variation within the population. The bacteria aren't becoming anything else. They're just staying bacteria. They're just different bacteria. So that can't be a mechanism for evolution because, like I say, evolution requires you've got to gain things. You've got to gain traits. You've got to gain genetic information to be able to move from one kind to another kind. And so what we really see, again, when we look at the observational science, because that's what we've been doing, right? These are things we study in the present.
That's right.
This is what is done in the lab every day. we see that it absolutely confirms and is consistent with God's word, that he created organisms, he created them to be able to adapt and change in a fallen world so that they can survive, but it certainly doesn't do what evolution needs it to do. So man's ideas about the past, that everything's evolved over time through mutation and these kinds of changes, the science doesn't confirm that. There's no mechanism to do what they need it to do.
So 30 years of studying bacteria, trying to just get something new, and they still haven't been able to do it.
The equivalent of millions of years, and they've not still been able to move it to anything other than a bacteria.
Well, Dr. Purdom, I want to thank you for being on the program. You know, evolutionists need a mechanism to get from a lower form of organism to a higher form of organism. They need something that is going to produce something new. And mutation, they say, does that. But as we saw today, the observable evidence shows the opposite. Mutation doesn't make anything new. In fact, it actually makes something that is really less and lower and less able to survive. It just goes to show that we know what the Bible says is true, and the proof, well, it's all around you. Thanks for joining us for this edition of Origins, and we'll see you next time.
For a DVD of this series, you can order online or send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling. And write to Origins Program, number 1817, Cornerstone Network, Wall, Pennsylvania, 15148.
This presentation was made possible by the faithful prayers and financial support of you, our Cornerstone family.